All right, yes, perfect. So first of all, we went over the analyst phase traps, and now we are going to go over the execution phase traps. Now, it's important to understand as well the difference between the analyst phase traps and the execution phase traps. Because for our bias, narrative, boundary, and the target, so the first 4 foundational levels, they essentially create that analyst phase. So the analyst phase traps right there is where we do have traps, but we have less emotions. Meaning that in the previous video, we went over, all right, you just basically need to take care on how long you're actually analyzing a chart before you come to the conclusion, is it high probability, low probability, through the use of the 5 stages of probability as well. Where there is traps, yes, certainly, but less emotional traps than on the execution phase. Where the executional phase, because you're actually moving on to now an entry pattern, so number 5 on the foundational levels, and number 6, risk management, there's a lot of emotions involved. The analyst and being an analyst overall is quite easy. Reason being is because there's no emotions involved. So whatever happens, if there's a wrong outcome, you might lose a little bit of ego because of course you're still wrong on your overall outcome, but it doesn't really matter because there's not really any monetary value involved. And that is the big difference, the big game changer. Because once we actually arrive to the entry pattern right now, there will be a lot of thoughts creeping into our mind where we start to doubt ourselves. Fear comes into play a lot, where we might lack the confidence overall to pull the actual trigger, pulling the trigger, meaning that we actually push the button to enter an order. And that is what we need to pay attention to. Now, there's 2 ways we can go over this. And again, like we mentioned in the first video as well of the Psychology Week, the first thing we are going to do is look at it from a technical analysis standpoint. After that, we are going to dive into the mind a little bit more, how we can actually overcome different emotions as well when our technical analysis standpoint, when the environment we are trading in is made as easy as possible. But again, we first need to fix that environment to then move on to that mindset part, to move on to the actual psychology in a deeper level. How can we do that? Well, it's again important to understand because we arrive at the entry pattern and because number 5 and 6 on the foundational levels, that's truly where the emotions now start coming in. So that is also truly where you want to have guidelines. You just need to have those guidelines. First of all, that is the most important part. Over time, once we transform from that beginner status to more so that slowly profitable, and then we start to get more advanced, more an expert, more a master, then we can let those guidelines go a little bit because we can control our emotions. But at first, we will likely be very emotional. So we need to have guidelines to guide us through it, to not get distracted by our mind. That is very important. So the first thing that we need to understand is knowing your entry pattern. So number 1, knowing your entry pattern. Again, we have already gone over entry patterns, but I'm going to ask you again, do you fully know your entry pattern? So if you were to write it to me, and if I were to send you a Discord message or even an email, and I asked you, what is your entry pattern? Then you should be able to recall that very easily, where you just have the ST plus re, or you enter on the flood or the lot, or the flood or the alt, sorry. So the flood or the overlapping defense. What do you enter on? All the specifics right there. What do you enter on? Do you know your entry pattern? Do you also know where you are looking for your entry pattern? So which PD array, which time frame do you now go into? I know, for example, if I'm going to recite my entry pattern to you, I'm going to say, well, it might be a weekly, daily, but I like to prefer the daily. So if I'm using a daily PD array, it's most likely going to be a Verweij gap because I mostly use daily Verweij gaps. The daily Verweij gap, that is where I need to have time agreeing. So I need to have time agree first on the actual news, so the economic calendar. Then after that, what I do is I go into my kill zone. For my kill zone right there, I just need us to tap into that daily Verweij gap right there, into the PD array. That creates that boundary. Then the swing high, previous day high, whatever it is, creates my target. For my entry pattern, that's going to be an ST plus a RE. I enter on the 15-minute fair value gap. So a 15-minute ST plus RE, I enter on the flood, which is the fair value gap. I cover the lot depending on if it's in context of the 1 hour, 4 hour, etc. So in my mind right now, what have I done? It's as mechanical as it can be. And our trading plan right there is 80% mechanical. Again, that 80% mechanical is not where our potential is, but that is just purely to keep our psychology in check, to not mess up where we're going into a chart and we just don't know what to do. So it's our guideline. The 20% is again where the potential is, the intuition part, the experience part, which over time we have to build. If we stick to the same thing, we have to build on that. That is where your win rate will increase, where your RR will increase. That will come simply through time and experience, where that is also slowly where you start to control your emotions. But again, like we mentioned, first having those guidelines. So the first step right there to achieve that guideline is, again, knowing your entry pattern. Do you exactly know where, when, and what you're going to do? Where do you get involved? When do you get involved? Do you know your entry pattern? Now, this is something, what I would love for you to do is you can write this down one time. And you can make a very long list of this. Doesn't have to be that long. We don't need to check it every time before we actually dive into the entry. It should just be ingrained into your brain. Because from my experience, and the reason why I say that as well, is because if we make a very long list, have a lot of rules, so we know exactly the entry pattern, it should be exactly 1 pip above the fair value gap, and my limit order should be right there. My stop loss should be, if we have a breaker, I do this, mitigation block do this, or block do this, lot do this. It's too much, and that is what I'm trying to avoid right there. Because if it's too much, that will also lead to psychology errors, where I just mentioned a very easy, simple trading plan, where I have my daily fair value gap. That daily fair value gap, I need to trade on a news day, so I need economic calendar to support the ID. Perfect. Do I have my kill zone to support the ID? Perfect. Hit the PD ray, then 15-minute ST plus re-enter flood, cover lot, depending if we are in context on the 1 hour, etc. Perfect. That's exactly what I want to do right there. So I know every single step. Now, that is where, like I mentioned, we don't want to have too much rules. So be careful of that as well. And if you do notice that before you dive into an entry, for example, and you notice in your own trading that you have too much rules and you're simply not reading it, you don't remember it overall, then take a step back and keep it as simple as possible right there. Very easy to remember. All right, that is the first step. Now, the second step is knowing your target. So again, before you even get into a trade, you already know the target. Now, we have gone over target as well, where I would just advise, let's go for a simple 1 to 2 first. And depending on what the context, the target on fourth foundational level is as well, that is what we can target. So before we get into entry pattern, and that is why the foundational levels is as well, number 4 is the target. So the target is what we know before we actually see our entry pattern. That is important to understand, because when we then get in a trade and we all of a sudden have to determine where our target is actually going to be, we are going to start to micromanage that trade. Micromanaging meaning that when you are micromanaging a coworker, for example, you're constantly reviewing what they're doing and you're constantly saying, oh, I would do this, I would do that. You're constantly on their ass, very easily said. And with a trade, this can also be done, where you're constantly viewing the trade. Constantly viewing that trade and not minimizing your chart time leads to doing what? Leads to increasing that risk of error again, where the risk of error is that we might mess up and we start to micromanage that position, meaning that we start to play with our take profit, start to now play with our stop loss, all things that were initially not in our plan. So avoiding that is, again, done through knowing your target before you get into the trade. That is why the foundation level number 4 is before entry pattern right there. So deck is, again, context target, context high, context low. or it's just a simple 1 to 2. For example, in my case, it's just a 1 to 2. I already know whatever my target is right there, it's a 1 to 2. I know that before I actually get into the trade. Perfect. So the third point right there is know your RM, which is your risk management. Know your risk management before you get into the trade. So when are you going to go break even? Now, again, this is where I do have to mention that our risk management right there has quite a few variables, right? So there might be a very different scenario one day that we take a trade to the other day that we take a trade. This is where we need to have one simple rule, as in we just need to say to ourselves, all right, if price has no reason to come back anymore, I'm going break even. That rule is not 100% mechanical, and it doesn't need to be. It's again that 80% mechanical right there and 20% intuition, because that 20% intuition right there is also where we can say, all right, if it's already close to drawn liquidity, it might still have a reason to come back. But from our intuition, from our experience, it should not return to our entry. So we can also go break even. Where mechanically seen, it's again when the lot is just now above our entry. For example, if we're buying. So that rule allows us to have a lot of thoughts that come into our mind again, where we should, all right, does it have a reason to come back here? Let's think about it. Perfect. And that is the mindset we need to have, because again, we can also make it like this, where we have 1,000 rules on very specific scenarios, where we have a fair value gap that is exactly 15 pips in diameter, and all those rules are not going to help. Believe me, because those rules are too much, they are too overwhelming for us to actually follow. So instead, we want to focus on understanding certain concepts to make very simple one-liners off of them, where you would say, for example, if we're going higher, where are we going higher from? That's also a one-liner, because that helps you instead of making 1,000 rules where those 1,000 rules are not beneficial because you won't follow them in your actual trading. That is exactly our goal right there. So knowing your risk management is, where do you want to go break even? Will you know your risk management the first time you actually dive into a trade? Well, you already have a great idea because of the things we went over. But this is again where you will not learn how to swim unless you dive into the water. So the first time you dive into the water, you will likely remember, all right, I need to do this, need to do that, but it will still be different. It will not be like the books where they tell you you should do this. No, it will be a little bit overwhelming. So allow that as well to happen. That's part of the process, completely normal. So know your risk management. Then the fourth one, and arguably the most important one, because this is the step to prevent things from getting worse, is limit your trading. What do we mean with the fourth step right there? The fourth step is very important, and the reason why I say that, for a very long time, actually for years, I have limited my trading, as in I am only focusing on one trade a day. One trade a day. That is even with a long list of pairs that I can potentially trade. So if I'm looking at a filtering process, I'm always scouting for the best pair to trade. When I get to a best pair to trade, I focus on one pair a day and one trade a day. Whether that's a loss, a win, or a break even, I stop trading. I would highly advise to do this as well when you're just starting out. No matter the trading plan that you might have, I am highly advising you to limit your trading in the beginning. Only one single trade a day. Then taking a step back, seeing what happens after that loss, what happens after that win, what happens after that break even. How do I feel? Journaling your thoughts. What does that mean to journal your thoughts? Well, very simply said, it's when you are journaling your thoughts before you get into the trade, you just very easily write down, how are you feeling right now? What are you actually feeling in the trade? So what are you feeling whilst I'm in the trade right now? I could write down, for example, I was a little bit hesitant to actually put in the trade, to actually pull the trigger. Perfect. Write that down. Because if you're not aware of those things, then you will always have that problem, that obstacle to deal with. The first thing to actually overcome an obstacle is, of course, to see the obstacle, and then we can climb over it. So that is the first important part, which comes through journaling. Then after the trade is over, whether it's a loss, a win, or a break even, take a step back. Preferably close your chart. Take a step back. Start to journal. How are you feeling? Why are you feeling that, do you think? Can you know what happened? Did you mess up somewhere? Did you do good? Even if it's a loss doesn't always necessarily mean that you messed up somewhere. It's also just probabilities. The basics of the market is understanding also the probabilities playing out. So this is absolutely key. And I want to take this even a step further, where something major that helped me in my trading was recording myself. It was simply recording myself, me talking to myself. What does that look like? Well, I actually have a very funny is, I'm not sure if you can see this right here, but I have all old videos right there where I'm simply recording myself trading actually. These are, what is that? That's 2 years ago. That's very funny. And it's just me recording myself and talking to myself essentially. When I'm trading live, or when I used to trade live, it's not live as in I'm not trading for someone else. I'm starting my recording program. The recording program I use is OBS. It's completely free. Your computer, etc., might depending on the computer you have, you might see how you need to set it up, etc. overall. But I use OBS Studio. It's free to download, etc. I would highly advise it. The quality overall, etc. doesn't matter as long as you can watch it back after the fact. If you can watch it back and you start to trade for that day, and you can just simply record yourself talking, just talking to yourself with a chart visually, and you record yourself, it's very beneficial. And the reason why that is because when you talk to yourself and you are trading, you are likely going to say a lot of positive things. And if not, we can watch that back and we can eventually say, hey, we were pretty negative to ourselves and we said a lot of weird things. Where, for example, in our risk management, we will likely not say to ourselves, well, I am now going to go break even earlier. That is not in my trading plan, but I'm going to go break even earlier because I feel a lot of emotions coming up. No, because you're recording yourself, it automatically almost feels like you are talking to someone. Even when there's nothing, there's no one there. But it feels like you have this obligation to actually perform your trading plan to the best. And this is what I would highly advise as well. Recording yourself trade. This is a big game changer in my trading journey as well. So if you can do that, I would highly advise it. So limiting your trading was the last step right there. And again, start off with one trade a day. Loss, win, break even, doesn't matter. Let's stop trading after that and let's reassess the situation. And then after, over time, we can always look to increase our trading frequency. The trading frequency can always be increased. That's not the problem. Let's try to first have very little trade frequency, as in just one trade a day first. That is very important. So after these steps are successfully done, so after these steps are implemented into your trading, we might still have fear coming up, which is, again, this is not to take all the fear away, because that fear will still be there. But these guidelines here help us to overcome that fear, because when we have that fear here and we are just following the steps, then all it takes next is discipline to actually still pull the trigger. Where if we have the discipline to still pull the trigger, perfect. Absolutely perfect. So fear and those emotions will still most likely come rising up. Where if we have the guidelines, they help us to make the environment very easy. What we are going to discuss later on is now that we need to become aware as well. So we need to become aware of the fact how we react to those emotions. When are the emotions coming up to rise, etc. That is all things we are going to discuss in the next video as well. So if we don't have those guidelines, then it's going to be even worse, because then we're going to be all over the place. But with those guidelines, with making the environment very easy to actually trade in, it's going to be easy to keep our psychology in check. So what does that actually look like? Well, let's take the example here again on NASDAQ. On NASDAQ right here, we had the weekly value, of course, which we can continue higher off of right there. And then afterwards, we just want to look for our entry pattern. So on the 4 hour, we actually had ahead of that NFP, we had this right there. We had a sting into that fair value gap. Perfect. Ahead of NFP. Now, this is where, in this situation, of course, I'm also going to show you a different situation, but in this situation, you could be more emotional. Why is that? Because ahead of NFP, we don't necessarily know where it's going to sting into. That uncertainty is giving us a little bit more emotions, as in it's putting us in a higher emotional state. That's very important to understand as well, because that should be controlled, as in you should be aware of the effect. And if you're aware of it, again, it's the first step to actually removing it. So right here, that could be a little bit more emotional. But once we actually sting into it, we see the rejection. We know our entry pattern. So we know right there what we want to see. 5-minute ST plus RE. Enter on the float. Cover the lot. Perfect. We know our target, because on the 4 hour, this is our target right there. We just simply want to target a 1 to 2. We know our risk management. Our risk management was, again, but price has no reason to come back to our entry anymore. That's, again, 80% mechanical, 20% is not mechanical, and it's completely subjective right there, which is not a problem. That is exactly the perfect boundary that we are looking for, the perfect balance, the 80-20 rule right there. Then we also know we limit our trading. So whatever happens after, we don't care, because once we take a trade, we stop. So right here, if we talk you through this process, then we first sting into it right there. Then we have the 5-minute ST, and we already have the RE at that moment in time as well. At this moment in time, remembering the 5 stages of probability, what we also went over, there's nothing for us to do right now. All we have to do in this moment in time, and this is why we have to follow those 4 steps, is knowing our guidelines. Do we understand our guidelines right there? 5-minute ST plus RE. Entering on the float. All right, we have the ST, we have the RE right there. Do we have the fair value gap? Right there. Perfect. The float covering the lot. Perfect. Well, we could argue again, this is also where over time that experience comes in, because my experience would tell me, hey, we can cover the bodies. Definitely right there. That is over time what you also develop. So then targeting a 1 to 2 above the context high. Now, the context high, we also know right there, context high reached, we definitely want to be break even as well. So right there, we just simply want to be break even. We enter, continue higher, break even, take profit right there. Now, of course, in between those stages right there, we are going to have different emotions. But as long as we can stick to the guidelines right there, it will become a lot easier. What are we going to do with the emotions that actually come up in our trading? That is also where we have psychology worksheets, which we're also going to work with. So I want to show you one more example, of course, on EU as well, where on EU, we had, of course, the daily fair value gap, which we can continue higher off of. The same exact example that we've been talking about for a while. Right here, this daily fair value gap right there. So we first have gone through the analyst phase, and the analyst phase was perfect. We got to a clear draw on liquidity, we got to a clear narrative, a clear target in the form of that right there, that swing high. So the first thing we know is, again, do we have new supporting on the day? Check, boom, nice, perfect. Do we have kill zone to trade on the day? Because I need that kill zone because I'm entering on a 15-minute right there. Yes, but we need to wait for London still. Perfect. So here we have Asia. We already had the ST in Asia right there. I know my entry pattern. So right there, I know my entry pattern already. ST plus the RE. And I want my fair value gap to be created in London. So the new order flow leg right there, the fair value gap should be created in London. All right, perfect. we have the creation of the FFI gap in London. Absolutely perfect. So right there, entering on the float, covering the lot. There's no reason to come back beneath that low. I know my risk management. Whenever there's no reason to return, I go break even, targeting a 1 to 2 right there. When is there no reason to go break even or there's no reason to go come back to our entry anymore? Well, after this already, we can argue we are closer to the take profit than we are to the entry pattern or to the entry level right there. So here I can definitely allow myself to go break even as well, knowing that we are creating a fair value gap. After this, it's early in London. It's 3:30 a.m. right there. So if you're in Europe or something like that, it's likely, what is that, 9:30 in Europe, generally speaking, of course, depending on where you're at. That would be me, 9:30 in Amsterdam. But that's very early. So what do you do right there? Well, if you are just starting out with trading again, you've not seen any profitability just yet in your trading career, stop trading. Stop trading. Stop what you're doing. And for the rest of that day, either just journal or go release your mind. Why do we do that? So the way I approach trading is purely based on psychology. At a certain level, at a certain moment in time, you will also achieve that. It's just keeping your psychology in check, which will exactly be the next video, which will the psychology meter, where you're constantly looking at if you are not overheating. So right there, take that opportunity, because here, when you have a very short trading day, so you didn't have to do all that much, that's absolutely perfect, because the next day, you are still going to come into that next day with a fresh mind. Where someone else that was trading this whole day is not going to have that fresh mind anymore. So that is very important as well to understand, which is exactly the next topic that we are going to touch on. So follow those 4 guidelines. Make sure, so I would love for you to write down those guidelines right now. Do you exactly know your entry pattern? Do you know your target? Do you know your risk management? And how are you going to limit your trading? Which I would advise 1 trade a day, no matter the situation. 1 trade a day. All right, perfect. Thank you.